To make our scones, we are going to use the rubbing in method, and we are going to cut our butter into our self-raising flour. And what this does is it coats each of the flour grains in a waterproof coating of butter, and that prevents too much gluten formation, which is the protein that we find in our flour, and that provides the structure. So if we were making bread, we would want gluten to be formed so that we get that nice springy texture. But with pastry and scones, we want it so that it's a bit more tender and it's a bit more crumbly. So we use the shortening method, where we rub our fat into our flour to create a waterproof coating. Okay. So start off with a knife, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to handle it as little as possible so that we don't melt the fat, which then makes it go greasy and it can go tough. So once you've got them into smaller pieces, you're going to use your clean hands, and using your fingertips, you are going to rub the fat into flour. Don't just squash it, you're rubbing it between your fingers. And it should just be the fingertips that actually get any flour on them. The palms of your hands should stay relatively clean. So start off with just one hand, finding the bigger bits of fat, giving your bowl a little bit of a shake. And rubbing your fat in. After a couple of minutes, you should have most of your fat rubbed in. You can always see if you've got any big bits by just tapping your bowl onto the table. If you're still struggling to get it to look like a sandy texture, so it should look like sand or breadcrumbs, just get it in between the two hands and rub it and lift it up. Until it's all rubbed in. What you now need to add is a pinch of salt. So just getting a small amount on your hand, so a pinch of salt, and you are going to add some additional raising agent. We're going to add 1 teaspoon of baking powder to our mixture, and that is going to help it rise even further. So that's going to give you a nice light airy texture, because along with the self-raising flour that also has baking powder in it, we've added the additional baking powder, and then that will allow it to rise by producing carbon dioxide. At that stage, if you are wanting to make a batch where you have got some sweet and you have got some savoury scones, you will need to split your mixture into 2 so that we can do some sweet and some savoury. So for my savoury scones, I have got some chopped chives, which I'm going to add. I have got some diced ham, and I am going to grate about 50 grams of cheese into my mixture. So you should just be able to use your grater, and then that will grate into your mixture. If you use a strong flavoured cheese, you can use less than if you use a mild flavoured cheese. Other suggestions could be some sun-dried tomatoes, olives, you might want to use some nuts, you could fry some bacon or chorizo. There are a range of other herbs that you could use, so you could always do some herb scones, which you could always use on top of a fish cobbler instead of a mashed potato top on a pie. Okay. So add in your ingredients and then just give it a stir around so that it is evenly spread. If you're making sweet scones, for half the mixture you will need to add about 12-15 grams of caster sugar, so that's about a dessert spoonful, so that's the middle-sized spoon that you would use. And then I am also going to add in some glacé cherries, which I have just given a bit of a rinse and cut in half, but you could always use some sultanas or raisins or any other dried fruit that you wish, or maybe even some chocolate chips. And again, just give that a stir to spread that through your mixture. The final ingredient that you are going to need is 125 millilitres of milk. If you have got accurate scales on the side of your measuring jug, use that, but if not, you can always just weigh out 125 grams. So if you've not got a measuring jug at home and you have got scales, you can get to 125 millilitres or 125 grams. For the final bit to make our mixture of our dough is you are going to add the milk a little bit at a time. Now, because we have split the ingredients into two, we will be looking at using half of the milk for each section. So just get yourself a knife and give it a stir. You can see how it's coming together into clumps, so that you're just adding a small amount of milk at a time. You don't want it to get too wet and soggy, otherwise we would need to combat that with adding some more flour into our mixture. Okay, so at that point I'm going to leave that there. And then with my sweet scones, I'm going to add some milk into there. As soon as we start to add the liquid, that is when the baking powder is going to start producing carbon dioxide and making our scones rise. So we do want to work relatively quickly at that point. Now, you might not need all of the milk, and if that's the case, we can brush some of the milk onto the top of our scones to glaze them. So that has then all come together into a dough, which isn't too wet or too sticky. If your dough is a little bit sticky, just get a bit more flour and then take your dough and just knead it slightly, and then you are going to flatten it out so that it is about 2 centimetres thick. You don't need a rolling pin for this. You can just use your hand to flatten it out. Okay, if you've got a cutter, the fluted side should be used for sweet scones and the plain side should be used for savoury scones. If you don't have a cutter, you can just use a knife and you can cut them into squares. So once you have cut them out, you are going to place them onto a baking tray. Trying to get as many out of your first go as possible, so that you don't have to bring it together too many times. So just bring it together, flatten it out to about 1.5 centimetres, and then get your scones together. I'm just going to leave that one so that there isn't any wastage. Once you've cut out all of your scones, and you can see that I've got 13 here, Spread them around evenly on your baking tray or on a couple of baking trays if they are a bit big. And then if you have got a pastry brush, with the excess milk that was left over, or maybe even just getting a bit of extra milk, or if you wanted it so that it was shinier rather than just golden, you could use an egg, or you could mix an egg with some milk. Just brush the milk onto the top of your scones. Don't worry if you've not got a brush, you can always just use your fingers by just dabbing it onto the top like so, just so that you're getting that even glaze over the top of your scones, which will give them a nice and golden finish. Okay. Your scones are now ready to go in the oven, so you need to get your oven gloves and you need to take your scones and put them in the oven for about 10 to 15 minutes on gas mark 5 or 180 degrees Celsius. Whilst the scones are baking, you will be able to clean up, so use a damp cloth to wipe down your side, and then some hot soapy water in your washing up bowl or your sink to wash each of your pieces of equipment that you have used, putting them on the draining board and then drying them up and putting them away once you have finished to achieve that purple.